Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 2023 Young Scholars Program Letter of Intent Process webinar hosted by the Foundation for Child Development. My name is Andrea Kent, and I am the Program Officer at the Foundation. Also joining me on today's webinar is Dr. Sarah Vecchiotti, Vice President, and Sharice Brammer, our Communications Officer, who is helping us behind the scenes. We are delighted that everyone is on the webinar today, and we look forward to receiving your LOIs. The purpose of today's webinar is to help you prepare a strong submission. During the webinar, we will provide detailed information on YSP's required letter of intent. We will discuss the kinds of research we seek to fund. We will review the application timeline, key dates, and the selection process. And we will provide tips for writing a strong proposal. Before we get started, I'll go over some logistics. If there are any questions that come up during the course of the webinar, please use the questions feature on your webinar window to submit them. Please submit general questions that can apply across any applicant. In other words, please do not submit questions that are specific to your proposal, your particular research design, or your anticipated data collection methods. If you do have questions pertaining to your specific proposal, please send them to ysp@fcd-us.org. Questions regarding technical difficulties with the GoToWebinar platform can be submitted at any time throughout the webinar and will be answered as soon as possible. Please submit all other questions closer to the end of the webinar, as some of them might be addressed during the presentation. We will reserve time at the end of the webinar for a live Q&A session. Additional resources to assist with the application are available and can be downloaded from the handouts feature on your webinar window. All of these resources can also be found on the Foundation's website. We recently added a new tab under the YSP page on our website called YSP Webinar Resources. Here, you'll find last year's LOI and full application webinars, in addition to last year's Advancing Equity webinar, hosted by the researchers investigating sociocultural equity and race, or the RISER network. We highly recommend that in addition to reviewing all of the resources in the handouts tab, prior to submitting your webinar, that you also view the full application webinar for further insight into the advisory committee review process, and the Advancing Equity webinar for a deep dive into how to incorporate an asset-based research perspective into your work. Lastly, later today, there will be two additional questions added to our YSP FAQ page. We have pulled together a list of resources to assist with the methodology, analysis, and interpretation of findings in both qualitative and quantitative research designs. We highly recommend reviewing this list and taking advantage of the resources that align with your work. Please continue to check on our FAQ page as we are often updating it. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Foundation's website. All registrants will receive an email once the recording is available. Introduction to the Young Scholars Program. YSP is a funding opportunity for postdoctoral early career researchers, typically providing up to 3 research grants per award cycle. Proposals may include research that utilizes a range of methodological approaches and then involve either primary data collection, secondary data analysis, or both. Proposals that engage primary data collection or a combination of primary data collection and secondary data analysis can be funded up to $225,000 over a 2 to 3 year period. Projects that focus solely on secondary data analysis can be funded up to $180,000 for a 2 to 3 year period. In addition to funding, as part of the program, scholars are provided with opportunities for professional learning throughout the course of their grant. An example includes an annual convening focused on translating research into policy and practice and implementation research. Scholars will become part of a growing network of the next generation of researchers whose work has the potential to make an impact on the well-being of the ECE workforce and the children and families they serve. All proposed research should have primary research questions that support the preparation, competency, compensation, well-being, and ongoing professional learning of the ECE workforce. Our focus on strengthening the ECE workforce has the potential to enhance the quality of children's early learning experiences, particularly for children across the birth to age 8 continuum, and to improve their chances of reaching their full potential. The early care and education workforce plays a critical role in promoting children's learning, especially through their interactions with children and through the enriching and nurturing learning environments that they create. We define the ECE workforce as the professionals who educate and care for young children and families across a variety of settings, including both center and home-based settings, and systems, including both regulated and informal systems, as well as the people who provide ECE professionals with leadership, support, and professional development. The ECE workforce may be defined in your proposal as including, for example, teachers, coaches, home visitors, administrators, higher education faculty, early childhood health and mental health consultants, etc. YSP supports research examining questions that are related to the following 3 ECE workforce goals. The first is professionalizing the field and building greater awareness of the status of the early childhood workforce. The second is enhancing the quality of professional practice. And the third is improving preparation and ongoing professional learning with special attention to institutions of higher education. Please refer to the YSP Guidelines, Section 3, Item A, for examples of questions that are related to these goals. Note that this list is not exhaustive, and there are many other research questions that you could potentially include in your proposal. For the purpose of today's webinar, we will highlight a few examples of research questions that align with the Foundation's workforce goals. Related to our first workforce goal, professionalizing the field and building greater awareness of the status and well-being of the ECE workforce, a few potential research questions include: does a policy of compensation parity across early care and education settings increase program quality? Does it improve the well-being of the ECE workforce and reduce teacher turnover, particularly for ECE professionals of color? And how does compensation parity result in better child outcomes? Related to our next goal, enhancing the quality of professional practice, some example research questions are: what classroom supports are needed to foster a nurturing learning environment? How do ECE professionals promote high-quality teacher-child interactions? How can ECE professionals engage in more positive disciplinary practices to better support the diversity of children across ECE settings? Finally, in relation to our last goal, improving teacher preparation and ongoing professional learning, with special attention to the influence and role of institutions of higher education, a few sample research questions include: how can teacher education programs redesign their programs to help their students better understand how poverty and other challenging contexts affect children's learning and development? How can ECE preparation change so professionals are more competent in tailoring instructional approaches to be responsive to the needs of specific subgroups of children and families? And how does ongoing professional development, such as the use of coaches, mentors, and communities of practice in ECE programs, change the practice of ECE professionals? The Foundation supports policy and practice relevant research that is focused on members of the ECE workforce who are serving the YSP priority populations of young children. These priority populations are defined by children who experience the harmful consequences arising from poverty, racism, prejudice, and discrimination across the birth to age 8 continuum. Included are children within the groups specified below: low-income families and/or those experiencing extreme poverty, children from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, immigrant or refugee families, undocumented minors, or children whose family members have been detained or deported, dual language and multilingual learners, children with special education classifications, children experiencing homelessness, victims of trauma and/or child maltreatment. And now, Sarah is going to talk about other elements of the YSP research focus.
Thank you, Andrea. Another dimension of YSP is the requirement for implementation research, which helps us to understand what the most effective components of a program are and what subgroups of children do or do not benefit from the intervention. Implementation research provides the opportunity to engage in meaningful exploration of what works or not, for whom and under what conditions. As the field engages in bringing more programs to scale, our ability to achieve greater impacts for young children rests on a more nuanced understanding of how programs are being implemented and the differential impacts on subgroups of children. With a particular focus on the role of the early care and education workforce, research questions for the proposed YSP study should support scientific inquiry into the implementation of specific ECE programs, policies, or practices. In general, lines of inquiry within implementation research include the following examples: determining how programs, policies, and practice are brought to and maintained at scale, identifying the effectiveness of components and their impact on child outcomes, understanding the conditions necessary to promote sustainability of a program, policy, or practice, assessing the fidelity and quality of the implementation, and informing continuous quality improvement. Implementation research is not summative evaluation. Rather, it attempts to explain what is happening, whether execution of a program or policy is aligned with its intended purpose, as well as to answer how, why, and for whom a program, policy, or practice does or does not work. Please refer to the YSP guidelines in Section 3, Item B, for examples of implementation research questions that relate specifically to the early care and education workforce. As background for your proposal, we strongly recommend reviewing 2 of the Foundation's publications to understand the Foundation's particular perspective and goals. Please review the 2020 Getting It Right Using Implementation Research to Improve Outcomes in Early Care and Education, and the 2022 Getting It Right, The Conversation Guide for Preparing the Next Generation of Implementation Researchers. The first explains the value of implementation research and provides guidance on various implementation research approaches and methods. The second was specifically designed for higher education faculty to use as a resource as they instruct future researchers to conduct implementation research. Both can be downloaded from the Foundation's website. Finally, all supported research should have clear connections to public policy, program, and/or practice, and have the potential to bring about positive change for our YSP priority populations and the ECE workforce. The policies and/or practices that are connected to your proposed research could be at the federal, state, local, or organizational level. They could be relevant to, for example, regulatory matters, program eligibility, program access, resource allocation, and/or the quality of services. Examples of policies and practices that could be studied include, but are not limited to, instructional supports for dual language learners and multilingual learners, coaching models as part of a professional development system, clinically based pre-service training requirements as part of teacher preparation, and compensation levels within and across professional roles. Again, these are just a few examples, and there are many other policies or practices that could be the focus of your research proposal. Next, Andrea will discuss the letter of intent selection process.
Thanks, Sarah. For the next few slides, I will review how the criteria for selection tie into the LOI evaluation. Please refer to Section 7 of the YSP Guidelines, Criteria for Selection, which can be found on page 8. An interdisciplinary advisory committee will review each LOI according to the following selection criteria: support of the YSP purpose and research focus, research concepts and methodology, cultural and linguistic sensitivity, applicants' qualifications, and institutional support and capacity. There are a total of 8 LOI evaluation questions, each given equal weight for a total score of 40 points. Further explanation of question details and selection criteria can be found in our applicant checklist and on the YSP guidelines on the Foundation's website. Also, take note that the Foundation's mission is to harness the power of research to ensure that all young children benefit from early learning experiences that affirm their individual, family, and community assets, fortify them against harmful consequences arising from poverty, racism, prejudice, and discrimination, and that strengthen their developmental potential. We further envision a world in which the diversity of today's young children is celebrated as an asset for building a strong and productive society. Therefore, throughout all stages of your research, from question development, methods and measures, through data analysis and interpretation, applicants should be utilizing an asset strengths-based approach versus solely utilizing a deficit-based approach. The fundamental principle of a strengths-based approach is that every individual, family, and community have their own set of assets that should be considered within all aspects of research design, such an approach celebrates the racial, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic diversity of young children, their families, and communities. It seeks to understand how policies and systems might, inadvertently or intentionally, function as contributors to disparities and focus on how to improve systems and practices. An asset-based approach also focuses on how to implement effective solutions, not solely on identifying challenges or documenting disparities. Such considerations should also be reflected in your LOI responses. To help you understand the strengths-based approach, last year we hosted a webinar entitled Advancing Equity by Conducting Strengths-Based Research in Early Care and Education, which was presented by the Research Investigating Sociocultural Equity and Race, or the RISER Network. This webinar is now on the YSP Webinar Resources page on our website. We strongly recommend that you watch this webinar to assist in your LOI submission. The first selection criterion that each proposal will be evaluated on is support of the YSP purpose and research focus. This criterion is the most important at the LOI stage and is scored using 3 out of the 8 LOI evaluation questions. The first evaluation question assesses how well the proposed research supports the YSP purpose by exploring the relationships among the ECE workforce, the quality of professional practice, and/or the learning and development of the YSP priority populations. The second evaluation question asks the advisory committee to consider how well the proposed research supports scientific inquiry into the implementation of specific early care and education programs and policies. Specific questions include, how well does the research confirm knowledge or add unique knowledge to the research base? How well does the research lead to a greater understanding of the priority populations? The third evaluation question will focus on the project's public policy and/or program practice relevance. The applicant's LOI should answer the following questions. What is the relevance and utility of this study for informing policymakers and practitioners' understanding of the issue? How much practical relevance does this research have for a likely positive impact on these policies and/or programs? How much potential is there for policymakers and practitioners to learn from and use the findings? Please also be specific about how you see different audiences using the anticipated research findings. The fourth, fifth, and sixth evaluation questions will assess the strength and quality of the proposed research concept, methodology, and analytic approaches. When writing your LOI, please consider the following questions. Are the research design and methodologies conceptually sound? Are the measures developmentally appropriate for assessing the population and effective in addressing the research questions? Please visit the YSP Webinar Resources page where you will find a previous webinar, Developing Strong Full Applications, hosted by one of our past YSP scholars, Dr. Krista Pereira, and one of our former YSP Advisory Committee members and former members of our Board of Directors, Dr. Vivian Gadsden. They speak about elements of a successful YSP application based on research design and methodology. We strongly suggest that you review this and other material related to YSP on the Foundation's website as part of your thinking process in developing your LOI.
The seventh evaluation question relates to the cultural and linguistic sensitivity of the proposed research. Consider the following. Are the methodology, measures, and data analysis approaches utilized in the research culturally and linguistically sensitive? Also consider whether the tone of the proposed study is asset-oriented or is it more deficit-oriented? Is it a strengths-based approach being utilized? There are important factors, especially when considering cultural and linguistic sensitivity. The eighth and final evaluation question considers several aspects of the applicant's background and qualifications. For example, based on the responses in the LOI, are the applicant's skills and previous experiences in line with the proposed research area? And will they be an asset in completing the proposed research successfully? As part of our due diligence, the Foundation will also review the LOIs to ensure that the applicant's degree conferral date complies with our set determined range. Principal investigators must have received their doctoral degrees between January 1st, 2013 and June 30th, 2020. Physician applicants must have received their MD degrees between January 1st, 2010 and June 30th, 2021. A minimum of 1 year must have elapsed since receiving their degrees before principal investigators may apply to the program. These are strict cutoff dates and not subject to change. At this stage of the LOI process, the selection criterion under institutional support and capacity will be used by the Foundation staff to help determine the eligibility of the host institution or organization. If awarded, the host institution or organization will accept the grant and will support both the research project and the applicant as the principal investigator on the project. Criteria for the host institution and organization are as follows. The host institution organization must have a 501c3 nonprofit status or be a public university. And they must have a minimum and annual operating budget of $2.5 million. The host institution and organization must also have a minimum of a 3-year history of leading and conducting multi-year research projects. Please note, these requirements are at the organizational institutional level and not for the individual department or division in which a particular scholar sits. Please refer to the institutional checklist linked on the YSP website for more information on institutional eligibility requirements and a list of the materials you will need from your host institution to support your LOI. During the next step of the YSP process, if invited to submit a full application, exactly how the host institution plans to support the applicant's completion of and dissemination of the research is considered as part of the evaluation process.
Next, I will review the application, key timelines, and dates. We are currently accepting LOIs for the 2023 YSP process through the online grants management system. Please refer to the YSP page on the Foundation website for details on how to access the system and how to create an account. The deadline for LOI submissions is 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, June 9th. In mid to late August, we will provide notification of LOI status and invitations for full application. The Foundation will host an additional technical assistance webinar for those invited to submit a full application, and on October 13th will be our deadline to submit the full application. Finally, by early April in 2023, the Foundation will notify those who have submitted applications whether or not they have been awarded a grant to support their research project. Now we will review tips on writing a strong proposal and provide some guidance on what to consider including in your research design and what to consider addressing in your LOI proposal responses. We would like to take some time to share some tips on writing successful proposals based on our experience working with early career scholars during the course of their YSP application process. Overall, please make sure that your LOI is clear on how your proposed research is not only responsive to the current solicitation, but share how you feel it aligns with the Foundation's broader mission and goals, especially in an effort to identify effective solutions. To the extent you can, share an understanding of how your work is part of a larger process of knowledge development. Look back at the Foundation's goals and highlight the ways in which your research advances them. We have 3 main tips to share with you in regard to writing a strong submission. Our first such tip is to focus on your expertise. Based on our review of the literature and our experience, we know that for many scholars at the early career stage, their contributions to scholarly work are perhaps at their peak. We want to learn about what experiences and skills your training and background have afforded you. It is important for foundations to know about you as a person and as a scholar to understand how an investment in you will not only inform the foundation's work, but also impact your future and your career. Another tip is to share any unique experiences you may have had. Many scholars engage in scholarship that is tied to personal experiences that have influenced their lens and approach to research. It is important for proposal reviewers to understand and appreciate your passion and commitment to your scholarship and your research. This is especially important for scholars engaging in work with vulnerable populations. The authenticity of this engagement is critical to its effectiveness, and authenticity is what reviewers want to see. To the extent that your training and expertise give you the ability to shed new light on an area is something important to note. Remember, foundations aren't just investing in your research, but in you as a scholar. So be clear about your point of view and the supporting rationale you provide for your proposed project. It is also very important to do adequate literature reviews so as to avoid referring to the work you plan to submit as novel when in fact similar research may already exist. Finally, our last tip is about doing homework on the funder. What the Foundation for Child Development's mission is and what the current programmatic direction is are all things to consider. Be aware of the specific research funded and how it is relevant to their current programmatic direction. Share in your proposal how you expect to extend this research and how in your research fits with the funder's current programmatic priorities. If this work has inspired or informed your work, it's important to note these elements in your proposal as well.
As you develop your research project, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of asking a mentor or a colleague, and this could be someone who is just slightly more senior to you, to be a sounding board for your ideas and give you critical feedback on your proposed study and your written drafts, including your LOI. To the extent possible, we recommend engaging such potential support during LOI development. The mentor-mentee relationship is essential to developing a strong, competitive proposal during the letter of intent and full application phases. We encourage mentors and mentees to clearly define their roles and responsibilities together and to determine their method of communication to obtain and provide feedback. On our website and in the handout section of this webinar is the mentor-mentee checklist that we created in order to help you do just this. Please utilize this checklist as a guide to starting this conversation with the mentor whom you are asking to specifically review LOI drafts. Mentors and senior scholars do not need to be tenured faculty. They do not necessarily need to be from your organization. They do not necessarily need to have content expertise in the research area you are proposing. In fact, having someone who may not work in your field, but who knows research and could read your draft for clarity would potentially be just as helpful. At the very least, applicants should review the proposed research project with at least one mentor or senior scholar prior to submitting a letter of intent. This slide represents specific suggestions related to various elements of the research design. We generated this list from issues identified from prior unsuccessful proposals. Therefore, as you think about your LOI responses, please consider the following in order to ensure that your proposal is successful. As appropriate, if a power analysis is necessary to determine the sample size required to detect effects, please include the analysis in the LOI to support the design. Not including such an analysis is a common misstep in the applications. Do not make this same mistake. Please see the resource list in the YSP FAQs for additional information on power analysis, as well as other research design considerations. These will be posted later today. Pay careful attention to selection bias in the study design and the sample determination. If there are concerns about selection bias, please mention these concerns in the LOI and how they will be addressed. Consider establishing inter-rater reliability when conducting qualitative thematic data analysis, even when a single rater is proposed. Finally, do not make assumptions about what your viewers will know. Clearly explain your research rationale and purpose, the contribution to the field, the policy and practice relevance of your work, and your strength-based approach. Fully explain in detail how the measures proposed are suitable for the research questions asked, how they're reliable, valid, developmentally appropriate, and culturally and linguistically sensitive. Also make sure to explain how they will be used appropriately. The advisory committee is excited to review your work. As they represent several disciplines, please use clear writing that is free of jargon to prevent potential misinterpretations.
Review the 2023 YSP guidelines carefully. All of the elements of the program, including research focus, application, institutional eligibility, and selection criteria, can be found in the guidelines. Additionally, the Foundation has created 3 checklists as resources to assist with the application process. All 3 of these checklists, along with the proposal responses examples packet, can be found on the YSP page on the Foundation's website and in the handout section of this webinar. The first list is the applicant checklist, which explains both LOI and the full application requirements for both the applicant and their institution and the materials necessary for submission. The institutional checklist is meant to be a tool for applicants to use when communicating the institutional administrative application requirements within their institution or organization. And the mentor-mentee checklist, as previously mentioned, is meant to help applicants and mentors develop clear expectations for working with each other and define parameters regarding the roles and responsibilities of the mentor and the mentee during the application process. In response to prior YSP applicant feedback, we share examples of strong responses to full application questions meant to be used as additional guidance when developing the LOI. This packet is a combination of exemplary responses to the following sections: research project basis and research questions, current state of knowledge and the significance of the present study, public policy and/or practice relevance, methodologies and measures, and finally, data analysis approach. Excerpts from written responses from various previously awarded applicants are found in the packet. With each example, an overview of the project, the form question, the applicant's response, and annotations are provided. We extend our appreciation to the former YSP scholars who are willing to share their work in order to help current and future YSP applicants submit strong LOIs. Thank you all for your time and effort in developing your future submissions. All of us at the Foundation are eager to receive your LOIs for this year's Young Scholars Program. Good luck. At this time, I'd like to turn the webinar back over to Sarah, who will start our question and answer period.
Thank you, Andrea. You may now submit any remaining questions for the live Q&A. Remember to submit a question, use the questions feature on your toolbar. Also, please remember to submit only questions that apply generally. Questions specific to your circumstances or research should be sent to the YSP mailbox at ysp@fcd-us.org. While you submit questions, we will begin by answering questions we commonly receive. First question, is there a specific time commitment scholars are expected or required to work under the grant? The answer is no, but the advisory committee will consider the appropriateness of the principal investigator's time commitment given other teaching and research obligations, and if the proposed activities can be accomplished in the proposed timeline, and if there is a justified budget for the proposed activities. And remember that those budgets are not required until the end of the full application process. Next question. What specific activities are allowable expenses for the use of grant funds? Funds must be used in a 2 to 3 year period. Funds will be used to support the principal investigator's salary over 2 to 3 years to cover their time and effort to conduct the proposed research study. Other direct research expenses, such as research assistants, can also be covered by these funds. Up to 10% of the direct personnel cost may also be used to support advisors and consultants. Indirect overhead costs are limited to 15% of the total direct personnel costs. International data is not allowable. Next question. Is a letter of recommendation required at LOI submission? Letters of recommendation are not required at LOI submission. However, if you are invited to submit a full application, 2 letters of recommendation will be required and must be submitted by the full application deadline. Letters may discuss the proposed research and the quality of research questions, significance of the proposed research, and the soundness of the proposed methodology and plans for analysis. Letters may also discuss the recommender's personal and professional impressions of the applicant. How does the foundation define underrepresented scholars for YSP? The foundation regards diversity as an asset for building a strong and productive society and is committed to diversity and equity in scholarship. We encourage applications from scholars who are underrepresented groups that have historically experienced poverty, racism, prejudice, and discrimination, including but not limited to researchers of color, first-generation college graduates, culturally and linguistically diverse scholars, and researchers from low-income communities. Scholars who represent a variety of disciplines and methodological approaches. Are collaborative applications between 2 scholars accepted? No. The applicant must be the sole PI. The PI must have complete control and decision-making authority over every aspect of the project. If you are unable to complete your project independently of another investigator, then you will not be considered a sole principal investigator and will not be eligible for YSP. There are 2 letters of recommendation. Does this mean you need to have 2 mentors? For the full application, 2 mentors are not needed for letters of recommendation. One of your letters of recommendation may be written by your mentor. However, it is not a requirement that 1 letter be written by your mentor. The most helpful letters of recommendation include an honest and critical evaluation of the applicant's written proposal. Please review the mentor-mentee checklist on our website for further detail on mentors. Are letters of collaboration allowed? For example, if a state agency is supporting your work, should you include a letter detailing this? You do not need to include letters of support from partners at the letter of intent stage. For the full application stage, you will be asked to upload letters of support from any schools, school districts, community-based organizations to confirm their cooperation and support of the proposed research project, including access to individuals to participate in the study. Are COVID-19 related ECE policy and program changes and their impact on the ECE workforce of interest to the foundation? Yes, these are appropriate YSP proposal topics, as long as the research questions are related to the early care and education workforce and an implementation research design is used. As a reminder, YSP supports implementation research that is policy and practice relevant, that examines the preparation, competency, compensation, well-being, and ongoing professional learning of the early care and education workforce. What was the ratio of the LOI submitted to the full application invited last year? During the 2022 YSP cycle, there were a total of 55 LOIs submitted and 39 were invited to submit full applications. To whom should I direct my questions to at this stage in the process? Email all additional questions to ysp@fcd-us.org. Please also refer to the 2023 YSP guidelines, refer to the frequently asked questions page on the Foundation's website. Phone inquiries will not receive a response. Now we will review and answer questions submitted during the webinar. You might hear brief moments of silence as we continue to review questions and prepare answers. Your patience is appreciated during these silence moments. Please note, we might not be able to answer all of your general questions submitted during the webinar, but please check the YSP FAQ page for updates. If your questions are not addressed live, please send them to ysp@fcd-us.org, and we will respond through email.
So we will now answer some of the questions that were in the question box. If you do have additional questions, please be sure to submit them promptly. So I do just quickly want to point out in the chat are the dates of eligibility that you may have received your doctoral degree. So eligible researchers must have received their doctoral degrees between January 1st, 2013 and June 30th, 2021. And physician applicants must have received their MD degrees between January 1st, 2010 and June 30th, 2021. There is a question about further defining implementation research, and I am going to again direct you all to the Getting It Right publications that are on our website. So first is the full Getting It Right publication, and second is the conversation guide. So please refer to both of those publications for a better explanation of implementation research. There is a question about mentors. So we talked about collaborative proposals. Each proposal can only have one PI. The YSP does not support proposals with co-PIs, but in regards to mentors, it is up to you to determine how many mentors or colleagues that you choose to obtain help from with your YSP proposal. So we expect that you seek out others to be a sounding board for you and provide critical feedback, but the foundation only has the expectation that at least one mentor will work with you in reviewing drafts of your LOI and potential full application. So one thing to note, if awarded, you can use up to 10% of your personnel costs to keep mentors on as consultants or advisors. So that is not a requirement, but just an option. There is a question about, do you have to work at the research institution, or can you partner with a different research institution that you are not affiliated with? You do have to be a full-time paid employee of the research institution in order to submit to YSP. So the research institution that you apply with, they will be the awardee. So please refer to our 2023 YSP guidelines for details on eligibility. There's a question about the number of LOIs invited forward to submit full applications. So we did just share that number previously. We don't have a set number of LOIs that we invite to move forward. It is about the quality of your proposal. There's a question about how many different proposals or projects can you submit. Each PI can submit one proposal per YSP cycle. There is no limit on how many times you can apply to YSP as long as you are still eligible. There's a question about getting feedback on unsuccessful applications. At the LOI stage, if invited forward, you are given feedback on your LOI. And at the full application stage, if you are not the recipient of an awardee, if you your full application does not make it through, we also offer the option for feedback. Please remember that if you do have questions specific to your research design, that you email them to the YSP inbox. There's another question about the number of publications required per your research institute for the institution that you apply with. So I'm going to ask you to please refer to the 2023 YSP guidelines for further detail on eligibility, both for the applicant, the scholar, and the host institution. There's another question. The question reads, can you have an agreement with a research institution that you will be a full-time employee if awarded? And the answer is that when you submit your LOI by June 9th, you must be a full-time paid employee of the institution that you're going to apply with. So we do have quite a bit of time left in the webinar, so I'm just going to remind you, if you have a question, please submit it via the questions feature as we keep moving. So there's another question about randomized control trials specifically. And so the foundation does not have a preference for qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods. What's important is when you're proposing your research that your data collection methods and your rationale are adequately supported and justified. And that across the whole process, including your design, your methods, your analysis, there is alignment across the proposals. So for randomized control trials, if it is within the implementation research frame, that would be an allowable submission, but it must be supported with the rationale for why you are including it. There's a question about our online grants management system, which is the system that you actually submit your LOI through. So please email the YSP inbox if you have any questions about our online system or if you're having any trouble with the system. There's a question about the advisory committee, what they want to know specifically about your experience and what draws you to your topic. So the foundation does want to hear about any experiences that you've had or a circumstance that you feel is related to your interest and expertise in your research topic or design or methods or measures. So this type of information, which really personalizes your proposal, is recommended to be included, but we cannot determine for you what you feel is most relevant in your expertise to support your proposal. So there's a question about how many proposals get funded each year. So generally, we fund up to 3 awards. Last year, there were 4 awardees funded. So we're going to ask that you check out our Meet the Scholars page, and you can view all of our scholars across time, and you can learn more about them. You can see the titles of their research projects and the institutions where they're from. So we highly recommend reviewing that page.
We've received some questions about whether or not implementation research is specific to just interventions and whether or not it is required to have an intervention or a pilot as part of the research proposal. No, that is not a requirement for implementation research. Remember, implementation research is looking at questions that examine what is happening in the execution of a program in terms of whether it's meeting its intended purpose, looking at things like fidelity and quality of implementation, looking at effective components of the program on child outcomes. So no, an intervention is not a requirement in order to have an implementation research topic, and it is okay to have a study about a previous intervention. It does not need to be part, an intervention does not need to be part of a current particular proposal. There's also here a question about whether or not it makes a difference, whether or not you're in your last eligibility year versus a previous eligibility or a more earlier recent eligibility. No, there's no advantage or disadvantage in terms of your year of eligibility. And how many proposal submissions do you typically receive in each cycle? So it does vary. Last year we received 55. In the year before we received around 75. So it does depend year by year. Last year we invited 39 to full application. In previous years we've invited 35 applications. So it really does depend on the particular cohort that is submitted and the advisory committee's review and evaluation about the quality of the proposals.
So I do have one more question that we're going to answer, and I just want to remind you one more time before we close the webinar for the day. If you do have any lingering questions, please submit them in the question box as soon as you can. The last question is, can one component of this project, of your submission, be funded by another research grant? And the answer to this question, the proposed study must be able to answer the specific research questions, and that must be able to be done in completion through the YSP funding. So it is possible to propose a study that is part of a larger project, but you should be very clear about what is distinct and different between the two projects. So to clearly explain what's different in the smaller study, what is unique and discrete versus the larger study, you must be very clear about your work plan and your budget, about what specifically the foundation would be supporting and what the smaller project would be supporting versus the larger project. So that is a possibility. And if there are no additional questions, there is one last question about the project being at a national level. The project does not have to be at a national level, so it can be at a state or a program level.
Or municipal.
Or municipal.
And for anyone who also wants to look at further definitions of implementation research, I do agree with Andrea. Please look at the Getting It Right publication. And if you are reviewing this webinar again, go to slide 11 and 10, because that's where we talk about implementation research and the different lines of inquiry within implementation research related to determining how programs and policies can be brought and maintained to scale, identifying effective components, understanding conditions necessary to promoting sustainability of program policy practice, assessing fidelity or quality of an implementation, and informing continuous quality improvement. Remember, it's all about answering the questions of what works or not for whom and under what conditions.
So I am actually going to answer one last question that was snuck in at the end. So if you are submitting through a higher education institution, we're going to ask that you use the university's 501c3 foundation in order to submit the proposal and the related tax ID.
There's also a question here about whether or not funds can be used to compensate early childhood educators to participate in that study. Well, that will come at the full application stage when you turn in a budget, but yes, that is an allowable expense. However, please note that there are some school districts who actually do not allow compensation of workforce members. So you'll have to be very specific to your particular region rules and regulations and your IRB.
So as a reminder, The slides from today will be available on the Foundation's website on the YSP page under the Webinar Resources tab. Currently, last year's LOI webinar and full application webinar are on the Resources tab, but after today, we will include these slides as well. So thank you all so much for attending and participating in our webinar. Again, a recording of the webinar will be found on our website. You can download the additional resources from the handout section of the webinar. After this webinar, we are going to ask that you please fill out a brief participant survey in order for us to get your feedback, and you should receive the survey via email very shortly. So this ends our webinar. Thank you for your interest in the Young Scholars Program, and good luck with your letters of intent.